Hello, friends. Good evening, good morning, good afternoon, wherever you are. Welcome to the 11th episode of Caste Conversation. I am Pradeep Pariyar. Caste Conversation is a dialogue to understand the caste dynamics that affect our society, our lives, and our value system. Caste Conversation is an initiative of Dalit Life Matter Nepal to ignite solution-oriented dialogue for the elimination of caste-based discrimination and untouchability. Dalit Lives Matter Nepal is a social movement to create a just society where every Nepali can enjoy life without the fear of being persecuted in the name of caste. It is an initiative to counter and fight back all form of caste-based discrimination and untouchability. Dalit Lives Matter Nepal is a connection with the people to build a collective force and amplify people's power to eradicate any inequality, discrimination, and violence based on the caste system. 11th episode of Caste Conversation brings you Professor Dr. Y.S. Alone, who is professor in Visual Studies, School of Arts, and Aesthetics at Jawaharlal Nehru University. He has published several research papers in journals and chapters in edited volume on ancient Indian art, mainly on Buddhist caves in Western India. Critique of modern Indian art, popular new Buddhist visual culture, and addition to the above research papers on the interpretative framework of Dr. Ambedkar and social sciences has been published. His research interests include ancient Indian art, Buddhist art, modern Indian art, and popular visual culture, new Buddhist visual culture, as well as general social sciences. There's a long bio of professor, so it's very hard to introduce professor. Professor Alone is engaged in conceptual formulation of protected ignorance. His critical engagement with the concept of protected ignorance has been explained through article and lecture text. He was nominated as ICCR chair, visiting professor in Shenzhen University, China. He has lectured widely in India and abroad. He has been member of various academic bodies and government committees. Professor Alone, welcome to the Caste Conversation. Can you unmute yourself, Professor?
Thank you. Thank you very much, Subodh. So it's a pleasure, and thanks for an invite. And frankly speaking, well, the invitation came as a surprise. So
thank you.
I hope I'm audible, and should I start my lecture?
Yeah, just wait. I'll just add one comment from my side, and then I'll ask first question, and then you can start. So talking about art and culture, I'll share my own personal story, and then I'll ask one more question, and then you can start. So talking about art and culture, I now realize my father purposely kept us away from the traditional practice of playing musical instrument. My grandfather played different instrument as an occupation, but my father didn't want his children to continue. Maybe he thought it would only perpetuate the casteist mindset and the associated dynamics of discrimination. The traditional music practice is it's kind of extinct in my family right now. It like every of other Dalits, the discrimination me or my family faces has not ceased, though it has transformed into more subtle ways. So my first question, Professor Alane, you have developed the conceptual framework, protective ignorance. Could you share lights on the institutionalization of protected ignorance? How has it been part of our everyday life? Floor is yours, Professor, and you can take 15 minutes for these questions. And yeah, welcome.
Thank you, Pradeep. As it came as a surprise, but let me just ask you one simple question. Will it be a kind of a dialogue, or first it will be a monologue, then it will be converted into multilogues?
We will ask the in chat box. Our friend can send them questions so that I'll ask more questions to you.
Oh, fine. Thank you.
But first, you can take 15 minutes. Please go ahead.
Yeah. So responding to your question about protected ignorance, I don't claim that I'm creating something new, or I don't claim that it's a new theory, but basically it is taken from the Buddha's theory of Pratyuta Samutpad. So I don't claim any originality in my philosophical ideas or anything. But yes, it is a critical framework. I would not like to call it a theory, but I would like to call it as a critical framework. And this is evolved in order to understand the politics of discourse and the knowledge production process which goes in our everyday life. And how do we really understand that? Now, there is an institutionalized way of knowledge formation process, which is also part of the project of protected ignorance. Say, for example, the very idea of sacred and divine is part of the protected ignorance. Now here you have this idea of sacred and divine as a part of protected ignorance. Now in a similar manner, you also have in the other side, which is, say for example, West, or say the Europe and America, which are considered as citadel of knowledge production or a new knowledge production and all those things. But to me, they are also part and parcel of protected ignorance. Because why I say so? Precisely because their knowledge formation process, or the kind of a knowledge production process that goes in their academic thinking and also in their day-to-day thinking, is also part of the protected ignorance, because they have not been able to dislodge their own normatives. It's very important to understand the normative. Now, likes of Foucault would like to call it as episteme, because the very idea of episteme is what he calls it as group of assumptions, or the prejudices and mindset that structure thought of a particular epoch. But to me, they are not of a particular epoch, but rather they are normatives. Why they are normatives? Because you do not wish to come out of it, you do not wish to question your normative, and the normative is all about presuppositions. Now, in the context of the Pratyuta Samutpad, the idea of presupposition doesn't exist. There is nothing called presupposition. Rather, any knowledge which is based on presuppositions cannot be considered as knowledge, or cannot be considered as a critical knowledge, cannot be considered as something creating any kind of an enabling process. Now, how do you understand this particular enabling process? I would like to give one further example. You know, the whole idea of caste discourse which exists, which started in India, and I must say that there are we have the tradition starting from Mahatma Phule, then come to Ambedkar, then come to Periyar, and then you have Sharad Patil, and further you have later on in political terms, you have many people in India who are part of this project of annihilation of caste, be it is Kanshiramji, be it is B.D. Borkar, be it is Bamsek movement, be it is any kind of an Ambedkarite outfit in India. And at the same time, the similar ideas also get transmitted outside India. So in terms of larger South Asia, because it is exclusively South Asian phenomenon, so one has to see how the hierarchies are being challenged. One has to see how there is a structured response that is coming through these kind of questionings. And therefore, one also has to see, I'll just give you one small example. I may take little more time, maybe little 15 minutes more. You know, the whole idea of caste, I mean, Varna and Jati, which is very much there in the academic domain, which is all the time being discussed. And then suddenly there is this whole idea of Dhumo, the ways in which Dhumo gets eulogized, and the ways in which, as if Dhumo was the first person to talk about caste, as if Dhumo is a demigod, as if Dumo is something who has come from the heaven. I'm sorry to use these terms, and then he becomes important, and aghast the Indians, not only Indians, the entire South Asian scholars, not only the South Asians, but the whole of European Americans, they don't look at what Dr. Ambedkar did, what Phule did, what are the discourses that have been created, and how the discourses have been challenged, and how the alternatives have been created. It is not my emotional response, but it is an intellectual response, precisely because Ambedkar was the first one who talked about caste. Ambedkar was the first one who defined caste. Ambedkar was the first one who put the characteristics of the characteristic nature and the structure that are very typical to the South Asian caste system. He rejected the idea of the colonial idea or the racial idea of caste. He rejected the Brahminical theory of caste. He rejected the Marxian theory of caste. He rejected the so-called egalitarian liberal theory of caste. These are kind of rejections which he does out of his personal experiences. So the personal responses, the responses of the the responses through which Ambedkar created his logic, or through which he was he made those kind of interventions. It's not only just the personal reflexivity. It's not that consciousness comes out of experiences, and that consciousness also has its logic, because one has to one has to understand the consciousness of being, and consciousness of being becomes an important category of interventions. Now, once you have these kind of categories entering into the process of interrogation, then one has to see what kind of a discourse you are creating. That is why I gave this example. Like Foucault calls it episteme. I would like to call it normative. It is as simple as this. But Dr. Ambedkar gave a solid one important idea, which is extremely important. But he makes this formulation of rules and principles in his annihilation of caste. Now, none of the people, they really understand the logic of rules and principles, and how this logic is applicable in every sphere of life, not only in caste, but also in general sphere. He also says that the Varna is a perversion. It's very clear. Varna is a perversion. And that is why I say caste is a psychotic perversion. So the formulations which have emerged in the 20th and 20th century, you know, what Europeans have created, I would like to term them equally as white Brahmins. So the entire post-colonial, the white post-colonials are the European American post-colonials, they are the white Brahmins, and they have adhered to that Brahminical kind of a discourse. They have created another kind of a Brahmanism, where power to interpret lies with them and not with others. And that is how you have to see the works of likes of this Nicholas Dirk, who made this idea that caste is a colonial construction. And similarly, Declan Twingley, who is a professor in UK Queen's University of Belford, and who wrote on this interpretation of caste. Can you imagine? There is no discussion of Ambedkar, no discussion of Phule. There is not even for that matter, their loved journal, that is EPW, Economic and Political Weekly, which carried number of articles by Sharad Patil, that also does not become a reference point. You see, these are all part and parcel of protected ignorance. And that is why I come heavily on likes of whether it is Dumo, whether it is anybody, you have to understand as to how the thought process begins. And then even the Jodhkar's book on caste, you know, it does not refer to Dr. Ambedkar's work. And when I asked him why you do not refer to Dr. Ambedkar's work, he says, "Arey yaar, I was talking about sociology and not about Ambedkar." See, that means you are willing to quote Radhakrishnan, you are willing to quote Gandhi, you are willing to quote all your nationalists, and these are all Brahminical nationalists. You are willing to quote all the Vedantics, all the likes of M.H. Srinivas and all those people, but you are not willing to quote Ambedkar. Why? You don't wish to get engaged with Dr. Ambedkar. So that is a clear-cut strategy. It is a political strategy which has been created by white Brahmins, which has been directed by the Indian Brahmins. Because the nature of informations which are being supplied, as if archives is something where the history lies. That is a misnomer that has been created. You cannot have history only through archives. It's very sad. It is a reductionist kind of an approach. And this reductionist kind of an approach has been employed, has been utilized so extensively that you have created only protected ignorance, because you have not been able to break your normative. That is one thing. You have not been able to see from, you want to see Indian society and Indian caste system only from the Dumonian perspective and not from any other perspective. You don't want to see how people in India have engaged with the discourses, and they have also created discourses. So the assertion is not all about space for space for articulation. Assertion is all about power of articulation. You see, one has to understand this idea. The post-colonials and all these people, they are all talk about space for articulation. That has not been a quest in the Ambedkarian paradigm or in the Ambedkarian discourses. You see, it's all about power of articulation. And this power of only through the mechanism of power of articulation, things are being challenged. So my critical framework of protected ignorance is all about challenging this. Even in the larger terms, like of Smita Patil or Abhinaya or even V. Gita, they are challenging those things. So this established notion of the knowledge system, the established notion of your superiority, the established notion of your sacred and divine getting challenged, and that is how one has to see as to how a critical discourse on the caste and its manifestations are being challenged continuously.
Yeah, very, very powerful thought, Professor. So let me take you a little bit next questions, especially on visual arts. You talk about a lot of art, photography, and creativity things. So how visual language such as art, photography, creative writings, and museum have formulated and reinforced caste mindset, and how it has to do with caste system?
Well, let me tell you a bit. The idea, like art has always been part and parcel of the propagation. It's not that the religious systems, the political systems have always used art for their own propagation. Now, you have to understand one thing, that there is something called self-information, that self-consciousness for many, those who come from the affluent section of the society, for them, that idea of self-consciousness gets into the mold of transcendental realm. Now, Dr. Ambedkar is not for the transcendental realm. You have to understand, it's not about the metaphysics. Your purpose of metaphysics is to define yourself, is to define your own power, is to define your own power of literacy, and also your whole authority over the discourse. Now, Ambedkar is not something, is not confined to himself, and neither it is transcendental, neither it is metaphysical. It is grounded in the deeper realities, where Dr. Ambedkar is raising the questions and creating an enabling process. Now, neither the post-colonialist, nor Foucault, nor Derrida, or nor even Rorty, or nor even Habermas have ever attempted to create an alternative discourse that will create any kind of an enabling process. See, Foucault makes a fantastic analysis of anarchy. There is no doubt about that. I mean, people read Foucault and get so much fascinated by that, so much seduced by that, that I mean, there is this whole idea of living and understanding anarchy in a perennial way. See, Dr. Ambedkar is not at all, not at all, he went into this metaphysical realm of anarchy. So he's understanding anarchy much in a human sense, much in a human sensitivity, but at the same time, he's also providing some kind of a solution or an alternative that by these methods you can reduce the anarchy. Now, Foucault does not give you that kind of solution. Derrida does not give you that kind of a solution. Nor even Rorty offers you that kind of a solution. Or even for that matter, when it comes to the likes of Habermas, who talks about the public sphere. Now, likes of Vikas Jambudkar would like to argue that without dismantling your private space, you cannot really dismantle your public space. It's such an important intervening category. Now, this intervention it comes out of their self experiences, and also it comes out of their not only just experiences, but also, you know, it is always reflexive in nature. So the experience of self of Dr. Ambedkar and his followers is not the experience of which is metaphysical in nature or which has transcendental in nature, but it is very much grounded in the realities, and therefore it goes into non-Vedantic logic. Therefore, it goes to the Buddha's theory of Pratitya Samutta. Now, the eradication of sorrow becomes important mix, and that is why I like the idea of opposition. Idea of opposition is to create a consolidation. Now, consolidation comes when you agree on certain issues, on certain formulations, that these are the methods, these are the problems we have, and we have to face it collectively. And that is where you have a shared aspirations. And without creating a shared aspirations, you cannot have the idea of Maitri. That is what Dr. Ambedkar talks about. Now, the Dumonian idea of understanding caste will never empower you to how to dismantle it and how to really create this enabling process through the method of compassion. Or for that matter, the Dumonian idea of homo hierarchicus and all, you have a lot of parallels which are there, I mean, almost the same. Say, for example, Timothy Flitzgert has made a wonderful analysis, what are the common characteristics of Ambedkar and Dumo. But irrespective of that, the sociologists and even the general social science people would not like to consider Ambedkar as someone who is important. Rather, they would like to bypass Ambedkar and then fall back on Dumo and all other people, and then make this whole idea, the interpretation of caste and all. I mean, to me, Nicholas Duff's book, or even this this person's what is that? This Quigley's book, you know, they are all part and parcel of protected ignorance. I mean, it is the most nonsense we have created. The post-colonial itself is the misnomer. What is post-colonial? Can anybody define post-colonial? Caste was existing in pre-colonial India, pre-colonial South Asia. Caste was existing even in the colonial India. Caste is existing in the post-colonial India, post-colonial South Asia. Or I should say the term post-colonial South Asia. So you have to understand. So what kind of a intervention you have created? You have not created any intervention. You have only lamented the whites, but you have not been able to even challenge the white discourse. That is again sad, because you are using their own tools, and once you use their own tools, you cannot have your alternatives. It is as simple as this. Now, the entire their interpretative frameworks which the postcolonialists have developed they're all dependent on Foucault, Derrida, and all the postmodernist Western philosophers. And when the European and Americans talk about their art and culture, they call their art and culture, when they write about history, that world history beginning from only in Europe, and it doesn't begin in South Asia. So the art doesn't begin in South Asia, as if art begins only in Europe. So these are the kind of things which have been created over a period of time, and likes of Charles Mills would like to categorize this as a white ignorance. I would like to categorize it as a protected ignorance, because protected ignorance to me is a much wider, has a wider application, wider applicability, and one can really all the time continuously interrogate the knowledge production process, whether it is aimed at killing your ignorances or aimed at maintaining the ignorances, or for that matter, it is all about, you know, how you shield your superiority. Just one small example: when likes of Gayatri Chakravarti Spivak talks about the sanctioned ignorance, now again she falls back on Gita, but she doesn't want to see like Gita is a Vedantic text, and how the Vedantism, which emerges even in the 19th and 20th century India, all the time legitimize the structure of the society and the structural thinking in the society. So the main structural thinking is not challenged, and this becomes hugely problematic. So therefore, the ways in which the artists are responding nowadays, especially like Savi Savarkar is the first one who challenged caste, then as in the visual terms. Now you have a fantastic example during Ambedkar's time, Bansode, whom Ambedkar praised like anything. The kind of a consciousness you generate through your performance and impress people and make them conscious is phenomenal, that which I even cannot do through my one lecture. So this is the power of art, which one has to understand, and how people have used. Now the trouble is that the scheduled caste being the worst affected people in the South Asia, the untouchables being worst affected in the South Asia, that is why they are the one who are challenging it. Whereas the middle section, that is the Shudra OBC section of the caste, they don't face that kind of a hardship when it comes to the untouchability. And the Brahmins have started mingling with them in the colonial times in order to create the larger bogie of Hindu identity. See, one has to understand, and that is the reason why likes of B.D. Borkar would like to raise this question, that the identities in India are given identities. These are not the ones which have been created or people have largely made it as a collective kind of an affinity, but these are the imposed identities, and Hindu identity is an imposed identity. And that is why one has to see even the Congress politics, which begins in colonial India, it is largely a Hindutva logic. It is largely based on the consolidation of the Hindus. And that is how the process goes on. And even in the post-colonial India or even the post-colonial South Asia, this phenomenon continues. And in the diaspora population, you do see all kinds of small societies and the associations and formations based on their respective caste groups. You have Tamil Brahmins has a different society and a social group working in America, and then you have Andhra Brahmins working very separately, whereas you have other Brahmins working very separately. So you have all kinds of these. I mean, you have to understand this logic, why it happens. Now, if the untouchables come together and they suddenly challenge, so that becomes caste assertion. But the ways in which the Brahmins, I mean and also the ways in which the Brahmanical discourse is propagated, and the ways in which these white Brahmins also become part of the Brahmanical discourse, that time they do not see it as their assertion of caste. You see, so for them, like, caste is something normal, but for untouchables, that becomes something abnormal. For the OBCs, that becomes something abnormal. So one has to see how these categories and these normatives have been created over a period of time, in not only in the South Asian context, but also in the context of the migrated population, the diaspora population. And the diaspora populations, I mean, they think that it's a great kind of a country, the great kind of a thing, the society is great and all those things, but that is not true. Rural India is full of caste. Rural India is full of hierarchies. Rural India is all about suppressing women, all about caste violence, all about performance of the violence. So the body is so violent that it always performs violence. Why it is so? Because your principle is based on the graded hierarchy, and therefore your rules have been formulated accordingly, and that becomes your root cause. And unless until you make any kind of attack or dismantle this root, you will not be able to really come out of these kind of stupidities. And that is how the artists have started responding in Maharashtra through literature, through performances, and now it is a visual arts. Now the visual arts, you have to see it is the photographic documentation, like some Savi Savarkar has created number of paintings on caste. You have Jaya Daronde, you have Rajyashree Gudi, you have Sudhara Kodve, who is a fantastic photographer. Then you have Vijay. You have a lot of people who have emerged and made their intervention very differently, and they are basically challenging this whole the the meta-narrativist ideas of this modernity and postmodernity. Now, I'm not against postmodernity or anything. It's not like that. But what I'm against is the ways in which these theoretical discourses being used in India. That is where I find it problematic. And this problem comes because there is a prevalence of white ignorance. But more so, there is a prevalence of protected ignorance that goes in the academic writings of the European and Americans, as if they are the only one who have right to interpret. So this right to interpret has not been challenged. The post-colonials, they make a critique of this right to interpret, but they have not been really able to develop a constructive critique of dismantling their own hegemonies, and that is why it becomes a problem.
Professor, we have more questions also. So you talk a lot about Ambedkar in this context. So let me, while we are talking about the Ambedkar, we need to talk about Mahatma Gandhi also. So let me put another questions. In your writing and speeches, you have said that Gandhi's love for the Shastra demonstrated that his understanding was deeply rooted in the religious dogma of the sacred dance of the caste institution. Could you tell us how and what is the difference between Gandhi and Ambedkar on caste perception?
Well, to cut short the discussion, I would explain it in different terms. You know, Gandhi sees problem of caste only in terms of untouchability. He thinks that by eradicating untouchability, we also eradicate caste. That is the larger thing. And Gandhi was a Vedanti. You have to understand this. See, it is Gandhi, Radhakrishnan, Tagore, Aurobindo Ghosh, Vivekanand. These are all the people who were Vedantics. Now, you also need to understand, like Gandhi sets up an ashram. Radhakrishnan, being a president, cannot set up an ashram. Aurobindo set his own ashram, and the Vivekanand set up his own ashrams. So you have these kind of people setting up their own ashrams and claiming that it is like the untouchables are also allowed, as if, you know, you are showing a large kind-heartedness, that kind of a things. And Gandhi understands non-violence through Tolstoy. Gandhi doesn't want to understand non-violence through Buddha. Now you see how the Brahminical mind works, you see. Now he sees only in terms of untouchability. Whereas, and Gandhi being Vedantic, so his belief in the Shastras, his belief in the Vedas, his belief in the Jati Dharma is very supreme. See, in the larger context, when it comes to non-cooperation movement, so Gandhi asked that you should not cooperate, and you should not give any lagan, or you should not give any tax to the British government. And that's fine, it's perfectly fine. But he also says that you should do everything, whatever you are supposed to do with your zamindar. So that means you don't want to dismantle your own structure. You don't want to dismantle your own hegemony. So the structural continuation of exploitation cannot be addressed, cannot be eradicated with this kind of method. So the change of heart is not is only a one-time kind of a things, but it does not create a real change, or it does not bring transformation. Whereas Dr. Ambedkar was not Vedantic, he is anti-Vedantic, he is non-Vedantic, and therefore he is not seeing caste only in terms of untouchability, but in terms of the larger social problem in India or South Asia, and how you can eradicate that caste. So when he wrote Annihilation of Caste, I mean, it's a fabulous text. There are a number of things which is there in that particular text, and you can interpret, you can write commentaries on that particular text. It is that kind of a text where you have wonderful ideas. Just imagine in 1935 he is writing all those things, and imagine what Dumo writes in 60s and 70s. I mean, it's so sad. I'm sorry to say this thing. I'm sorry to use this word. I'm not a sociologist, and neither I have love for Dumo or anyone. I respect people's scholarship, but at the same time, I will be very critical of those white Brahmins and also those people who are following the Brahminical discourses. Now this is where one has to understand, like, how Dr. Ambedkar was for the dismantling of the whole structure, whereas Gandhi was not dismantling of the structure. So there is this degree of difference that always remain, and therefore Ambedkar and Gandhi, they cannot come together. It is as simple as this. They will remain opposed to each other because one is a Vedantic, another is a non-Vedic. Non-Vedantic, non-Vedic. That is a fundamental difference which people have to understand. And those who talk about combining Gandhi and Ambedkar, let them first declare that they do not belong to any caste. Let them declare that they do not believe in the idea of divinity and the sacredness, and that we do not believe in this body of text which perpetuate hierarchies.
Yeah, very valid point. And then we have more questions, and then friends, you can also ask questions in chat box also. So you have a talk about the Brahminic re-legitimization, and in few interview you have mentioned that there are few contestants on the Brahminic hegemony. Since the Brahminic hegemony is deeply rooted in and it has played a vital role in shaping caste mindset, how could Dalit activist and academician could contest Brahminic hegemony? I know this doesn't have a ready-made solution. You already talk about the Brahminical hierarchy and hegemony, but as you have explored out of the visual language, what are your thoughts on contesting the Brahminical hegemony? Would you like to know, would you like to share more on this?
The Brahminical hegemony has always been contested by people who are opposed to caste, and all the time, then at least I have not seen anyone who can really offer a solution that is other than what Ambedkar has done. It is, I just give you one parallel example. It is something like the Buddha is eulogized as Lokottara. The term Lokottara, it exists in the Pali literature, and people read it as a Mahayana creation. That is another stupidity people have created. And so this idea of Lokottara, if you understand, now how do you understand this idea of Lokottara? So the Lokottara is something like the one who is above people, the one who has created the theory of Pratitya Samutpad. And can you really replace that, even if after achieving Nibbana? Can you really replace that, the theory of Pratitya Samutpad? And nobody so far has able to come forward and replace that theory of Pratitya Samutpad. It is as simple as this. Now, in a similar way, I have not seen anyone who has come and really said it very seriously and practically proved that this is what are the ways in which you can dismantle the whole idea of caste. Now, there are Marxists who have tried to attempt it and said that, but then again their logic is based on this whole base and superstructure theory. Now, the basic superstructure theory is again a very reductive kind of an approach. And though it is codependent, but at the same time, it is not determined by by the economic structure alone. One has to understand that. An IS officer's son in India is also abused by caste. वो देखो वो चमार का बेटा जा रहा है. This is how things are in India. Now, irrespective of becoming an IS officer, what is the guarantee that his son will not be prejudiced or he will not be discriminated on the basis of caste? This becomes very fundamental question, and therefore Dr. Ambedkar proposed this annihilation of caste, and therefore he proposed that the root has to be dismantled completely. One has to understand the difference between end of caste and annihilation of caste. You know, the later people, likes of Sharad Patil and all, they talked about annihilation, the end of caste. You know, you have to end the caste. So it becomes a new kind of a slogan. It becomes a new kind of a discourse. You know, as if it is a new kind of a discourse. But to me, it is not at all a new kind of a discourse. Rather, it is so much rooted in your own structural thinking. It is not coming out, you are not coming out of it, as simple as this. And the Ambedkarian discourse is all about dismantling and coming out of it and create a new society and create a just society and make democracy work in every respect and democratizing the entire social system. That becomes the objective. Now the people who work on caste, most of the time they are objectiveless. Now, likes of Nicholas Dirk is objectiveless. I mean, saying that caste is a colonial construct, I think that is the biggest bullshit which has been created, and people are following it and making it gaga gaga, and he's not being questioned. And the worst part is that the so-called claim, you know, the Ivy League universities are the so-called this best 200 universities in the world. They are following it. They don't want to dismantle their own things, own thinking. And that is I mean, they also become part and parcel of the protected ignorance.
Yeah, we have a question from one of the photojournalists, Usaji, Usatitikchu. Usaji mentioned that I'm curious about Baba Bhimrao Ambedkar and Buddha photo of a sculptor together in our everyday life and practicing patriarchy, masculinity, and specific faith. I agree with Professor that art history is not only in Europe. I don't understand why post-colonial study became basic in academia. Professor, what is your observation about Dr. Bhimrao Ambedkar Museum in Delhi?
Well, let me tell you very frankly, the museums on Dr. Ambedkar have been created as a part of the erstwhile governments who were in power, who wishes to showcase Ambedkar more in terms of as an appropriated icon. You see, it is not something that has been created by followers of Ambedkar, and followers of Ambedkar don't have that much of amount of money where they can really create a museum on Ambedkar and they will curate the museum. Neither we have that kind of a manpower, nor we have that kind of a resources. Now, as far as the following of the patriarchy and all those things, these things are concerned, yes, I admit that there is a practice of patriarchy. But let me also tell you, you know, those who are converted, those who follow Ambedkar in later end spirit, they will not follow these kind of patriarchal values in their house. This is, and there is a transformation. I have seen myself, my own relatives transforming themselves and talking about the like we see in my household we didn't like, my father worked in a household, so so do any kind of a household work for us was not something new. Neither it was new to my cousins and the other sisters and all there in our locality. You see, I was born in Chandrapur. I'm born 1963. After 1956, so I'm a post 1956 generation. And that 1956, it was such a thing in Nagpur and Chandrapur where people came back and threw all their images from their houses and started enjoying that freedom. So I, being born in 1963 in a family which is already have a liberal, which have discarded these kind of ideas and values and all those things. And every time, whenever there is a protest march of the Republican Party of India, the children, the women, old, young, middle-aged, everybody, similarly, all the men, old, young, middle-aged, everybody would go. I have not seen that kind of a participation in any protest march in India. Let me be very clear. And I'm very proud of that kind of a tradition. So it is only Ambedkar tradition that is setting this kind of an agenda. And that is why today you see a lot of people coming for protest, lot of people demanding their rights. Even today, like all the other groups, other than the scheduled caste groups, they have started realizing the importance of constitution. They have started realizing the importance of equality and how those things has to be protected. And one also has to understand when Dr. Ambedkar talks about the idea of Maitri, so he says compassion is very important. It is not about fraternity, but the fraternity is based on Buddha's compassion. And what is that compassion? So the compassion is all eradicating your sorrow, understanding that sorrow and making a meaningful dialogue. Now, you cannot, unless until you break that hierarchy, you cannot have equal terms. You cannot, so the caste is all about treating other person unequal. So the inequalities enter. If you consider it as your normative. That is why I said, like and Foucault call it as episteme, whereas I call it as normative. Now these normatives has to be dismantled. Now who is a person, who is an icon in India, who are really analyzing these normatives, who are really talking about these normatives and dismantling of the normatives? You have only two people. That is Mahatma Phule and Dr. Ambedkar. As simple as this. If you go into the history of colonial India, these are the only two people who are for this dismantling of this normative, and therefore one has to see that the Buddha and the image of Buddha and image of Ambedkar plays an important role. They are not understood as something divine, or they are not understood, or they are not there in the household as something divine and sacred. You see, we revere Ambedkar, no doubt about that. We have a lot of respect and love for Dr. Ambedkar. Because why we should have love? Why there have been other untouchable leaders, but we don't have that kind of a love. Why? Because you have to see from the philosophical perspective. Dr. Ambedkar was very different. His philosophical persuasions were very different, and he always tried to create some kind of an enabling process. And that creating an enabling process is to give some kind of an empowerment in your thinking and dismantling your own hegemonies and ideas, and also the nature of structure. So therefore, while doing so at ideological level, you try to do that, and then at the economic level, you try to liberate yourself from your traditional occupations and go and work in different areas and make that kind of a living. Now, I don't understand why people from other castes have joined the band of Safai Karmacharis in India, the sanitary workers in India, and do all kinds of the menial job. Let the Brahmins, let the Rajputs, let the other OBCs and everyone do it. Let us equalize it, as simple as this. But this process of equalization has not happened at all. So one has to understand this, and then I also wish to add one thing. The icon of Ambedkar, which comes in a public sphere, that has its own history, and you have to see that how people fought, because the Congress was putting Gandhi everywhere. So you have to see the political position of the Ambedkarites in India. It's not that they were against, you know, the Gandhi cannot become the icon for modern India as simple as this, as a future of India. Dr. Ambedkar makes it very clear. Gandhi is return to antiquity. In his Pune lecture, he makes it very clear. Gandhi is all about return to antiquity. Now, you cannot return to antiquity. The Ambedkar's idea of claiming past is all about claiming the good values. You see, the ways in which people are talking about this Vasudeva Kutumba and all those things, it comes from which Upanishad? It comes from the post-Buddhist Upanishad, which is a much later idea. But that the whole these are the kind of these are the important, you know, contradictions which one has to understand. And at the same time, there is a process which is gradually going in dismantling these kind of ideas.
Professor, we have 4-5 questions. So
Yeah.
if you can explain briefly, that would be great, because we have a limited time. So I'll ask a few questions. So Brishali from Mumbai asks, the demonization of people that such upper class and upper caste attitude brings about is done very subtly, whereas the ones directly impacted by or having to live in the most difficult ecological situation are Dalits. Would you have insight to offer an ecological visual manifestation of caste? So if you could brief on this answer, that would be great, because we have more questions here.
You know, I would like to answer in a very different way. You know, what I observe, my observation is that the Karmat Brahmin in India is always protected by the moderate Brahmins. Now, there is a critique, or there are disagreements which are coming from every section of the society on certain issues, which is very welcome. But at the same time, this very section does not want to present a critique, or does not want to tell people that you should not follow this, that these are bad things and you should abandon these things. Say, for example, their belief system and their ritual systems. So they will never make a critique of their belief system and ritual system. They will never make a critique of their idea of divine and sacred. And that is where the problem comes. Now, having said that, the people always feel that the upper caste are demonized. Now that demonization comes out of the personal experiences. The ways in which, if you read the autobiographies of the untouchables, so the untouchable is defining himself in the perception of others. Similarly, what Kancha Ailaiya does is that he is defining his own self-consciousness in the idea of the others. Now, he also says that there is a graded hierarchy in the economic structure in the villages and the traditional occupations, and therefore one has to take it as, you know, as part, though you take it as a part of your living or part of your means of living and everything, but does that process becomes a very egalitarian kind of a process, or does it creating any kind of an equality? That is what his questions are. And therefore, you have to see whether any person who present a critique of a caste, or whether it is upper caste or it is a lower caste, from any kind of, you know, I'm not against of it. Let me tell you very frankly, but I would like to judge their standpoint. I would like to judge their literature. I would like to judge their knowledge production, whether it is adhering to the Vedantic logic or it is going in a non-Vedantic perspective. That is philosophically, that is how I will see. And then at the same time, I will also see that whether the person who is making this kind of an intervention, whether they are in a position to dismantle their own presuppositions. You know, have you dismantled your own presuppositions? That's a question which one has to ask. And at the same time, you can see, like, I have archived some of the important things. There was an Ambedkar, somebody had wrote on Dr. Ambedkar, put that site. And then on internet, there were abuses written on Dr. Ambedkar. Now you see the what kind of a digital literacy people have and how it is being used by certain set of people. Now those who are writing that kind of a language, why their own brethren or their own caste men or women really educate them, it becomes their responsibility. And that is how Dr. Ambedkar says that philosophy is for the reconstruction of the world and not to explain the origin of the world. It's very simple. So one has to see this logic, whether they have been really able to reconstruct, and in the process, whether they have dismantled their own presuppositions, or for that matter, the trouble in South Asia is that those who speak against caste, and especially outside the scheduled caste fold, you know, they become numerical minority, but they do not take the responsibility of changing or bringing any transformation to recruit in their respective social group. This becomes a huge problem. And you will see in an area like Vidarbha or larger Maharashtra, you will notice that the non-scheduled caste population, they started interacting with the scheduled caste population. And what is a way of interaction, which is an agency that is becoming, you know, a mediating factor. See, Ambedkar is the only agency which is becoming a mediating factor. Or for that matter, the Chamars of northern India or Uttar Pradesh, they when they come to Maharashtra, they mingle with Mahars. The Mahars, when they go to Uttar Pradesh, they mingle with the Chamars. They don't mingle with their respective social groups or anything. Why it is so? Because the only criteria is Ambedkar. The same thing goes with all the interstate thing. If I go to Kerala, if I go to Tamil Nadu, if I go to Odisha, my agency of interaction is Ambedkar, not because I'm untouchable.
Yeah, you mentioned very correct point. Actually, who we interact, who we talk. So it's a very important question. I just want to follow up one more questions to you. We live in a Hindu-dominant culture, so most of our people also follow same social culture norm they have, and it's hard to walk on path shown by Buddha. So how do we cope with that? So if you could be brave, that would be great.
Can you repeat?
So we live in a Hindu-dominant culture, so most of our people also follow same socio-culture norm they have, and it's hard to walk on path shown by Buddha. So how do we cope with that? So behavior and Buddha path. So,
well, the solution is very simple. Dr. Ambedkar formulated these 20 pledges at the time of conversion. So just follow them, it becomes very easy.
Okay, very sweet answer. Thank you, Professor. So we have a question from Sudiksa Rasaili. So this is a little bit different questions than what we're talking about. I just want to put and ask you, and then maybe you have a different opinion on this. So how is the division amongst the Dalit not be the obstacle for one who hold a strong union? And how will the division not be the reason behind rising of discrimination? So internal discrimination, say talks about.
Well, you have to see that phenomenon in region wise. When it comes to the designation or the surnames or writing about the names, and there are caste specific names, say for example, in a state of Maharashtra, the moment you write Meshram, the moment you write Ramteke, you know, which are a very typified scheduled caste surnames. Okay. Now, similarly, when it comes to northern India, you have certain kind of a family names which are which become caste names. Now, in a state like Maharashtra, there are certain family names which cuts across the caste. You cannot identify person with that kind of a caste, but generally you categorize, this must be this tax. Say for example, family surname like Shinde. So they are in the non-untouchable communities. They are in untouchable communities also. So you have cutting across the caste lines. You have these kind of family surnames. Whereas in some cases they are there, they exist, and they have a very standardized, very the stigmatized kind of an identity. But the question is like how this process of identity has been created, and this process of identity gets formalized. Now this very process of formalization is a bad process. Now how do you come out of it? And then at the same time, one one also has to understand the the nature of psychotic perversion that enters in the functioning of the human mind, because you want to see person only in terms of caste. Like you want to know who is this person, what caste he belongs to, what is his, what is that, this kind of a questioning goes. And this kind of a questioning goes in the mind of the caste Hindus and not in the minds of the untouchables. You have to understand that the untouchable, the disease of untouchability is not with the untouchables. The disease of untouchability is with the touchable community, mainly the caste Hindu community. They are the one who are affected by this disease, and they are the one who have to be administered all kinds of remedies or the medicines. There, there comes the transformation. So the remedy is all about transformation. Now, how many political? See, in at least in the context of India, I can say one thing, that I need to see politics in terms of Ambedkar and anti-Ambedkar. Ambedkar politics is all about transformation, whereas anti-Ambedkar politics is all about maintaining a status quo and not going for any kind of a transformation. Now, I'm not talking in terms of political parties. Even the political parties, uh, you have so many political parties. Whether these political parties are also engaged in transformation, that is a real quest which one has to see. And you also need to see their economic policies, whether their economic policies is really dismantling this traditionalism and the accumulation of wealth only by the certain section of the society. That is where the problem comes. And therefore you have to see that no society can grow without support of the government. The entire private sector in India is thriving on government money. Let me tell you very frankly, it is through loans, all kinds of disseminating factors. You have all kinds of means to make them reach. But have you ever considered any kind of a means that will really eradicate the poverty? I mean, imagine in last 70 years, what you do, you keep changing the criteria of poverty. One of my friend who is a fantastic IS officer in the Haryana cadre, Dr. Rajshekhar Gundru, when the poverty criteria came, he talked to his chief secretary, sir, if this is what is followed in Haryana, then you cannot have this kind of a poverty criteria in Haryana, in a state like Haryana. And therefore, the chief secretary of Haryana had to agree that the additional criteria had to be put. And that is how the surveys were made in the entire Haryana with regard to poverty and all those things. So you need to have a critical thinking and a thinking that will really address people in respective regions. So you can't have one singular criteria of poverty in India. So it differs from one place to another place. Let me also tell you, the tuberculosis deaths in India are enormous, and it is confined to the most of the tribal population. The majority of the tribal population is facing the problems of the tuberculosis and HIV. Now you cannot have medicine as a remedy. You have to see that their life pattern changes. So you need to bring this kind of a cultural change, and this cultural change comes by dismantling your prejudices, by dismantling your presuppositions. So
Uh,
the
Professor, actually, we have planned to finish within a few minutes, but so many friends asking so many questions, so I'll take a little bit longer this session if that's fine with you. So can
no
we go
problem.
up to next 10 minutes?
Yeah, absolutely no problem.
Oh, okay.
Try to
Okay, that's thank you.
like,
But if you could be brief, that would be great. So
yeah, sure.
I'll ask one question. Our friend Raz Razak asks, how Brahminical hegemony continue for 3,000 years? Is it hegemony by consent from Dalit Bahujan? If yes, how can Dalit Bahujan withdraw their consent? So can you, would you please elaborate on this? But we have other questions from
The,
friends. So if
the
you could be brief, that would be great.
Yeah, I shall be brief. Historically speaking, the hegemony comes as an imposition. And there is also a period in Indian history where this hegemony is challenged. And and that is how Dr. Ambedkar's thesis of revolution and counter-revolution in ancient India comes. So it's all about how the hegemonies get challenged and then how they are re-established in a later time. So the hegemonies are on two terms. One is a political terms, and second is the social terms. I'll just give you one small example. Say in the inscription of Nasik cave, it is written that the Gautami Putra Satkarni, he stopped the intermixing of Varna. So you can imagine that how the Varnas were going around intermixing them, and he stopped it. So it is a clear-cut instruction of following the Brahmanical religious order, which you find in Manusmriti. So you have these kind of impositions coming from the political authority. And that is why political power becomes very important. Whereas the areas or the places where the kings had no such kind of an ideas and tried to be neutral. So there is always this level playing field that happened in the ancient India. And everywhere the dynamic was very different. And this is also a misnomer to say that the Dalits or the scheduled caste in India have accepted that kind of an hegemony. No, that is wrong. That is completely wrong. There are you have wonderful writings at the philosophical level as to how the caste gets opposed by the Buddhist thinkers, and this is beautifully analyzed by Sharad Patil in Caste Feudal Servitude. Then you have very good example of Ravidas. Say, for example, in one of his line, he says that if Buddha could do it, why I could not do it? So you have this kind of interesting thinking that goes in the people's mind. You have Kabir, who is a fantastic revolutionary thinker. So you have number of those people. It's not that caste was never opposed. Caste was always opposed. Hegemony has always been opposed, and you have to see from their respective standpoint, respective cultural context. But at the same time, you cannot eulogize everyone all the time. This process of eulogization that begins in 20th century is a very bad process, and one has to see who are the people who can really be good for you in your future, or making society modern, or making society to follow equality and not to believe in this kind of psychotic perversions.
Professor, we have a question from Sudha Chandragupt. You already mentioned many things on this question, but I just want to repeat this. Would you like to elaborate more on difference between idea of protected ignorance and identity politics, especially in India? Maybe this question to relevant Nepal also. Protected ignorance and identity politics in India.
You see, identity politics has a long history. if you go into the writings of Dr. Ambedkar, he was not creating identity politics. He was talking about the representation. So his quest is representation in every sphere. So you have the political representation and the representation not only in the ideological terms, but also in its physical terms. You have to understand this nature of physicality in terms of representation when it was a demand by Dr. Ambedkar. That is one aspect. The second aspect is that identity politics indeed is all about protected ignorance. Why? Because whether your identity is really largely adhere to the principles of humanity or not, that is what one has to see, and whether your identity is creating that maitri and karuna, that one has to see. Today, everybody, at least what I've been observing, you have a Jat Mahasabha, you have the Gujjar Mahasabha, you have the Saini Mahasabha, you are in Maharashtra, you have Madi Sabha, you have all kinds of Jati Sabhas. So these are all part and parcel of your identity politics, and this identity politics will never strengthen the nation. It will always weaken the nation, it will always weaken the economy, and through this identity politics, you cannot change. The identity politics is very important when it comes as a part of political empowerment. You see, people, though some people don't agree with this kind of a thing, but largely the assertion of the middle class groups, which is largely OBC, and they are the one who are in power, and they are the one who managed to get power in different terms, whether through Congress, whether through BJP, or through any other political party, in at least in India, or in outside India through any other political party. They managed to create some kind of an economic wealth. They also managed to create some kind of a business for themselves and for their own communities and stuff like that. So you have to see that process. But that identity politics is largely part of the protected ignorance, precisely because why do you want that identity? Why can't there be the neutralized kind of an identity? Say, for example, the Ambedkarite identity is a very neutral kind of a term. Anybody can claim that Ambedkarite kind of an identity, and one has to differentiate between the Ambedkarite and Ambedkarian thinking. There are people who are Ambedkarite. There are people who have Ambedkarian thinking. Now, the Ambedkarian thinking has to see the other religious group can have that kind of an Ambedkarian thinking. There is nothing wrong in that. But you have to differentiate and understand this thing. So your identities, whether your identity is really aimed at dismantling your own ignorances and dismantling your own presuppositions or not. That is a real question. If your identity is all about dismantling hegemony and dismantling your own presuppositions and the presuppositions of your society, then there is nothing wrong in having any kind of an identity or any kind of an identity politics. Say, for example, a Jain Muni will always be addressed as Jain Muni. The Buddhist Bhikshu will always be addressed as Bauddha Bhikshu. Similarly, a Hindu priest will always be addressed as Pandit. Very simple. So whether that Muni really practices some kind of a hierarchy in terms of the practices in the society, or whether he propagates those kind of practices. So you have to see which are the people who are propagating equality, and whether they are propagating constitutional morality. So morality becomes very important, and that is why Dr. Ambedkar says Dhamma is morality, morality is Dhamma. And one has to see whether you are propagating constitutional equality, constitutional morality or not. Because there is a lack of constitutional morality, therefore there is a lack of political morality. Because there is a lack of political morality, therefore there is a lack of constitutional morality. And therefore the identity politics is all about protecting your own self, protecting your own nature of presuppositions.
Thank you so much, Professor. This is my final question for you. One of the friend, Ganga Bahadur Biswakarma, asked this question, but I just want to add on this. You can make your concluding remarks after these questions. So we have a few minutes only. So what is your idea to transform the caste system? So, and then you can put your final thoughts or comments, anything you have, and then we'll wrap up the sessions. Please go ahead, Professor.
Well, the annihilation of caste as proposed by Dr. Ambedkar in 1936 is a key text and is the most seminal text, and there he has shown the path. And I have not seen anyone who is creating any other alternative. And for me, that's very important, and that is what people have been propagating and people have been doing, and that is why I always maintain that the rise of class struggle in India has always resulted in the rise of process of Sanskritization, and the Marxist, the leftist, the socialist, they do not have answer to this question. You will get answer only in the Ambedkarian framework and not in any other framework, not in any other thinking. So that is very pivotal, and that is how you can. And one of the example is there is a large fossilization that is happening in the state of Maharashtra, where people are converting to Buddhism irrespective of caste. So that itself is an example, and I'm not saying that that has completely reduced the graded hierarchy, but it is indeed has set an enabling process to reduce or dismantle the hierarchies.
Any final thoughts, Professor, and then we'll wrap up.
Well, final thought is I just wish to say that people always talk about rationality, and the philosophers always say that the rationality is always relative, and I always accept this argument that rationality is always relative, but its relativeness depends on its objectives. If the objective of the rationality is to ward off ignorances, it becomes righteous rationality. And if the objective of rationality is to protect the ignorances and not to and to keep the hierarchical structure intact, so then it becomes that rationality becomes a protected ignorance. And one has to see as to how the Indian diaspora, the South Asian diaspora, the people in South Asia are so much moved by these kind of irrationalities, and as long as these irrationalities exist, you cannot create any kind of enabling process. And to create any enabling process, you have to dismantle your presuppositions, you have to create a righteous rationality, and at the same time you have to resolve. There has to be a righteous resolve and also a righteous determination to oneself to say, to declare that you will not believe in these hierarchies and that you are for creating equal society. It is not one day phenomenon, but it's a process that has to be maximized, that has to be created, and at the same time it has to be brought in the larger political, social, ideological, and philosophical, and also in a materialistic discourses.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Professor Alone. Thank you very much for joining with us today. This is a really wonderful conversation, especially thought-provoking, especially young generation inspired from this conversation. Thank you for your work. Maybe this is one of the untouched area. Maybe I can say this. We have come to the end of today's episode of Caste Conversation. On behalf of Dalit Lives Matter Nepal, I want to thank you everyone for your solidarity. I also thank Professor Alone as a special thank you. Maybe we'll invite you sometime after Corona in Nepal. I wish to listen to you more. I'm also thankful to my friends, Kalyani, Sunayana, Prakriti, Bridika, Suluchana, Vikas, Vijay and Roshan for making this possible. Thank you very much. Friends, we'll see you next week with another guest to talk about caste questions in Caste Conversation. This is Pradeep Pariyar signing off for today. Namaste, stay safe wherever you are, stay healthy and stay happy. Thank you, Professor, once again. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you everyone. Thank you. Good night.
Good night. Thank you.